I developed a way of looking at this through the implicate order that's based really on quantum theory. And the way it works is to consider that there's a wave. You may think of this wave coming from outside, from the whole universe, which converges to a point and then diverges again. Now, it links everything. It means that everything is internally related to everything. Now, one of the images I gave of it was of a piece of paper which you fold up to a very small bit, and then you make cuts in it. When you unfold it, you find a pattern, right? Now, I'm proposing that basic laws of quantum mechanics can be understood in that way, that we can think of some sort of unfoldment into a wave and then re-unfoldment into something more like a particle. So then each particle then enfolds all the other particles, and in principle every part enfolds the whole. It will matter, of course, which view we hold. If we have a view of wholeness, this will enable us to work differently from when we have a view in which everything is broken up. Now, the mechanistic view tends to lead to, at least give support to fragmentation. That is, we know that our whole life is now fragmented. We can see it into nations struggling with each other, into all sorts of professional groups and ambitions, and we hardly need to get, and inside each person there are many fragments, different objectives and different purposes fighting each other. Now, if we take the view of mechanism, we may regard all these fragments as essentially real and independent, and then we cannot deal with it. Now, what we have to see is that these fragments are actually the result of our wrong way of looking at the whole. That we are looking at the whole as if it were made of fragments, and our very action in response to this helps to break things up some more, apparently. For example, if we say the world is broken up into nations, we see each nation as independent. That's going on now, whereas obviously they're highly mutually dependent and organically related, or even more fundamentally. And the attempt of each nation to behave independently creates a response which strengthens the apparent fragmentation.
We don't really understand the nature of our thought process. We're not aware of how it works, and it's really disrupting not only our society and our individual lives, but also the way that the brain and nervous system operate, making us unhealthy or perhaps even subtly damaging the system. And now, Krishnamurti recognizes that thought, rational, orderly, factual thought, such as in proper doing science, is necessary and valuable, but the kind of thought that he has in mind is self-centered thought. That is, now, at first sight, one might wonder why self-centered thought is so bad. If the self were really there, then perhaps it would be correct to center it on the self, because the self would be so important. But if the self is a kind of illusion, at least the self as we know it, then to center our thought on something illusory, which is assumed to have supreme importance, is going to disrupt the whole process, and it will not only make thought about yourself wrong, it will make thought about everything wrong, so that thought becomes a dangerous and destructive instrument. If you just think of the word self, its basic meaning is the quintessence, the essence of all essences, and that would of course have supreme value. Now, if we assume there is a self, and we feel that this stirs up the whole mind and brain inside, so it feels just from that assumption that something is going on inside, which corresponds to this assumed self and gives it an apparent reality. Now, once it has been assumed that this self is real and not merely an image, it's attributed reality, then everything becomes, it takes first priority and everything else comes second, so everything is distorted. Yes, because this image of the self, the concept of the self is assumed to be so all-important, the brain starts to develop a defense mechanism to defend this image against what we call, quote, apparently, to defend the image against perception of its falseness or illusory character. You can see this very easily, that if somebody says you are an idiot, there's an immediate response to say, I'm not an idiot. That it's painful to have an image of yourself as an idiot. Therefore, you say you're wrong, and you may start adopting all sorts of false explanations to show that you are okay and the other person is the idiot. But this is only a minor point compared with the tremendous energy that comes in when the very existence of this image is apparently threatened by some evidence that it's only an image, it's only an illusion. Then the entire brain starts to be disrupted, the brain and nervous system, and as a result, a defense mechanism comes in just to block it or to wipe it out or to turn attention somewhere else. Now, this defense mechanism, part of the defense is to make us unconscious of it. You see, the major form of defense is simply concealment of what's going on, because if we could see what's going on, it would be obvious it's an illusion. It's like seeing through the trick of the magician. So also, all the ways I've described, such as forgetting and zapping your mind or jumping to something else, are modes of concealment. You may also conceal by just denying that it's so and asserting something else. And therefore, we are not conscious we are not conscious certainly of the defense mechanism, because this process of concealment itself has to be concealed in order to make it effective. And therefore, the defense, the major part of the defense, consists in making the whole process unconscious. Krishnamurti is suggesting, proposing, even saying that the self is not the source of thought, but rather thought is the source of the self. Now, that may seem paradoxical to our ordinary experience, but at least we can make it reasonable. You see, if we're saying that the assumption of the self creates inside a kind of image of the self corresponding to that assumption with great power, and that image is attributed reality, and you get a feeling that it's real. Therefore, you form the assumption that there is the self who is the thinker, the source of thought, and there is that which he is thinking about, and besides that there is the thought which is produced by the thinker, which refers to what he is thinking about. Now, therefore, the things which really are solidly existent in that view are the thinker and what he is thinking about. Thought is a very ethereal, almost non-existent thing. But what is being suggested instead is that the thought process is real. It's going on in the brain and nervous system, and this thought process contains in it the assumption of a thinker who produces thought. So it's as it were producing a television program of a thinker producing thought, and the mind is watching that program so intently that it takes that to be the reality. And then, therefore, thought now says, I am very modest, I am serving the thinker, but in fact it's serving itself, because it is always, it produces this thinker and then does what this thinker wants. When I first met Krishnamurti's work in First and Last Freedom, and one of the things that most intrigued me was his statement, the observer and the observed are one, and this reminded me of my work in quantum theory, where the observing instrument, what is observed, cannot be separated. Now, later I could see that that meant really the same as the thinker and the thought are one. And but what also seemed important to me was that Krishnamurti was looking at things in a rational, factual, or orderly way, just as in science. And it seemed to me that was very crucial to apply this orderly way to the psychological question. And in fact, he was looking at thought itself in this way, and looking at the self in this way. It seemed I had not ever seen this done before. And I thought it was crucial, because up till now I thought the self was the one thing you could never look at in such an orderly, rational, factual way. And that this was at the key to all our problems. And so that is really what, as a scientist, what attracted me to Kay. Now, one point is that he brought in the notion that of the religious mind, meaning by religion, I think the emphasis on wholeness. And he said the scientific mind can be part of the religious mind, the scientific approach. And I said that if you could do this, then you would have removed the principal objection to religion, which was that it tended to be very irrational and attached to all sorts of arbitrary preferences of the self, you know. Krishnamurti talked a great deal about conditioning, and he admitted that certain kinds of conditioning were necessary, such as learning to do things. But there's a kind of conditioning around the self which is extremely strong because it contains assumptions of absolute necessity. You see, the self is considered to be something supremely important, and whatever it needs is regarded as absolutely necessary, which means that it cannot be otherwise, it cannot yield, and therefore it takes first priority and it pushes everything aside, including even the requirement that thoughts should be correct and true. And therefore it immediately starts self-deception going, and that is why thought becomes dangerous, because if thought deceives itself, it is really very dangerous. I would say that thought in itself is not intelligent because it is restricted to being the response of past assumptions and dispositions that may no longer be relevant. And those assumptions and dispositions are not capable of questioning themselves because they're rather like a computer program, and something more is needed to become aware that the program is inadequate and to question it. Now, see, we could call that intelligence. Now, I don't think science has much to say about that today. Some people are talking about artificial intelligence, but that's something they hope for in the future. Now, I think Krishnamurti is suggesting that intelligence is of a different quality from thought. It does not even originate in the brain. It originates somehow in some very subtle reality which we cannot locate in space or time, but it acts within the brain to do these one of its actions is to question the assumptions and dispositions that we are in thought. I think he meant that the action of intelligence really acts physically on the brain cells to remove remove the destructive conditioning. Now, let me remind you that this conditioning around the self is very powerful, and it leaves a real physical change in the brain. As Krishnamurti put it, this takes root in the brain, so that, for example, even though you may see that it's foolish and false, it still goes on. It has taken root, it just doesn't go. And the way we would understand that is to say some change in the brain cells has occurred, so it's not enough just to see it's false. And the ordinary thought process or thinking process cannot handle this because it's far too difficult. It can't get at the structure of the brain because it's controlled by that structure anyway. Now, Krishnamurti said that this action of creative intelligence can really touch the brain cell physically, and we could think of it removing the program, you see. And leaving the brain free of that kind of conditioning, which is destructive. The word insight is hard to define, but I would think it's an action of creative intelligence. And the way I would understand that is if you think of awareness and attention, that the attention in a way gathers the whole condition of the brain and focuses it in a form in which creative intelligence can act. And creative intelligence then acts toward that condition, not on the image, but on the brain cells themselves. You see, it's like saying that if there's a fault in the television set, you don't act on the image, but you act on the set. Now, the insight is then both the perception of that state of the brain and the action toward it, which are not separate. And this insight can then be said to alter the brain cells and remove the kind of conditioning that is around the self-centered thought. I think the ultimate purpose of Kay's work was stated very early in his life, in his work, which was to free humanity from the destructive conditioning we've been talking about. That is, this conditioning around the self-centered thought is really an enslavement to absurdity, to destruction, to unhappiness, sorrow. And no other kind of freedom means anything unless we are free from that. And therefore I think that he felt that once man was free from that, then the way would be open to creative unfoldment in all sorts of directions.